Jonathan Roumie stepped onto the set of The Tonight Show with the kind of calm that didn't need to announce itself. The lights didn't change. The music didn't stop. But something in the rhythm felt off as soon as he took his seat. Jimmy Fallon greeted him with a wide smile, the kind that usually signals a good time ahead, and the audience offered the kind of applause that says this segment is supposed to be fun. Everything was lined up for a standard interview. A few laughs, maybe a funny story from set, probably some heartfelt moment near the end that wraps it all up with a bow. That was the format. That was the expectation. But Jonathan wasn't here for that. Not really. He saw it before the conversation even began. A small cross tucked just under Fallon's lapel. Not flashy, not staged. It looked like it had been worn for years, the kind of thing you put on out of habit, not for attention. Jonathan's eyes rested there a second too long, and Jimmy noticed. He adjusted the lapel slightly without thinking, almost like he wasn't used to it being visible on camera. Jonathan didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just watched, quiet, present. Then he looked away and leaned back in his chair. Fallon jumped in the way he always does, quick with charm and energy. He asked about the show, about how it felt to carry a role like Jesus, about fans treating him like a pastor on Planes and Strangers, asking him to pray for their kids in line at the grocery store. Jonathan gave short answers, polite but flat. He wasn't rude, he wasn't guarded, but something wasn't lining up. Fallon tilted his head slightly, gave a small laugh, then asked if he was doing okay. That question opened a door Jonathan had kept closed for a long time. He shifted in his seat and said he was fine, but then paused. The kind of pause that people only take when they're trying to decide if they're about to say too much. He looked Fallon in the eye and said quietly, "I didn't expect to feel what I'm feeling right now." Fallon straightened up slightly, surprised but listening. Jonathan took another breath, not shaky but deliberate, and said, "I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to talk about the show, the interviews, the projects. But if I walk out of here tonight and don't say what I came here to say, I think I'll regret it." Jimmy raised his eyebrows a little, not out of concern, but curiosity. The audience wasn't sure how to react yet. They were still waiting for the moment to flip back to light. Jonathan wasn't flipping anything. He looked straight ahead and started to speak not as a celebrity, but as a man who had carried something too long and was no longer willing to hide it. He said there was a season where he didn't know who he was anymore. He kept showing up. He kept delivering the lines. He kept doing interviews and smiling when people thanked him for helping them find faith. But inside, everything felt hollow. He said that sometimes being seen as a symbol makes it harder to ask for help, harder to admit when you feel lost, harder to say out loud that you're not okay. He said he never talked about it before, because the minute you show that kind of vulnerability in this business, someone finds a way to twist it. But something about that moment, that room, that quiet little cross Fallon wore without making a statement about it, that broke something loose. Jimmy didn't speak. He didn't try to interrupt. He just sat there. And for once, the show didn't feel like a show anymore. Jonathan leaned in slightly and said, "I've never told this story on camera, not once. But tonight, I need to." And Fallon nodded once, slow and certain. No lights changed. No music played. No reaction shot. Just a man sitting across from another man, both of them realizing at the same time that this conversation was going somewhere very few ever do. And this was only the beginning. Jonathan didn't jump into it. He didn't rush. He waited, even after Fallon gave him the space. He sat still for a few seconds, just looking down at his hands. No fidgeting. Just holding them together, fingers laced tight. Then finally he looked up, not at Jimmy, but just past him, like he wasn't talking to a person anymore, but to the moment itself. He said there was a night when it all nearly ended for him. Not because of drugs or drinking or scandal, nothing dramatic. Something quieter, something slower, something more dangerous than any of that. He said it felt like he had drifted too far out into something cold and silent, and every time he tried to speak to God, he couldn't feel anything come back. And he didn't say it with theatrics. He didn't try to make it sound poetic or tragic. He said it plain, like a man who remembered every detail. He said the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty. He said you can be surrounded by people who love your work and still feel like no one knows your name. He said you can have your face on billboards and still come home feeling like you don't exist in your own life. He said he didn't tell anyone, not his family, not his team, not the cast. Because when people look to you for hope, you don't want them to see you falling apart. You just smile, you just nod. You just say, "I'm good," and move on. But one night, he couldn't move on anymore. One night he found himself sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, thinking about how quiet it would be if he just disappeared. Fallon was frozen, not stiff, just quiet. And that quiet wasn't polite. It wasn't for show. It was real. Jonathan glanced at him briefly and said, "You don't have to say anything. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because if I don't say it here, I never will." He looked down again and said that he didn't sleep that night. He just stayed there, sitting up, phone in his hand, not even scrolling. Just staring at the screen like it might suddenly give him a reason to keep going. And then he remembered a moment. A very specific moment. From a show just like this one. He didn't name names. But he said there was an episode where a guest talked about losing someone and what that kind of grief does to your faith. He said it was the first time in weeks he had felt something crack open inside him. Not a flood. Not a breakthrough. Just a crack. But that was enough to let in the first bit of light. That was enough to keep him from standing up and walking out the door. That was enough to make him stay in the room. Fallon was still watching him, still not moving, still listening. Jonathan leaned forward a little. He said, "We spend so much time trying to look composed. We spend so much energy trying to look strong, and that's the lie. Because the strength doesn't come from pretending. It comes from surviving. It comes from staying when every part of you wants to disappear." He said no one claps for that. No one hands you a trophy for not giving up quietly in a room where no one sees you. But it still matters. He looked at Fallon again, this time directly. And he said, "I came here tonight because I thought I'd talk about faith and art and storytelling. But the truth is, Jimmy, I think I came here to say thank you. And not the kind of thank you that fits into a segment. I mean a real one. Because I don't know if you understand what it means to someone to see faith not being sold, not being polished, but just quietly worn, like that cross. Like you didn't put it on to say anything. You just put it on because it's yours." Fallon reached up and touched the edge of the cross without thinking. He still hadn't spoken. There wasn't anything to say yet. Jonathan didn't let up. He kept pushing into the moment. He said the hardest part about playing someone like Jesus isn't the responsibility. It's not the pressure. It's not even the weight of the message. It's the silence after the applause. It's the question that never goes away. Who are you when no one's looking? Who are you when the crowd leaves? He said that's the part no one trains you for. That's the part that can break you if you don't deal with it. He said faith doesn't save you from that part. It just keeps you breathing through it. He said there are a lot of people who think faith is about being loud or confident or always right. But he said for him, it was never loud. It was a whisper. It was the thing that stayed when everything else left. And sometimes, he said, that's the only reason he's still here. Not because of strength, not because of willpower, just because of that whisper. The one that says don't go. Not yet. Fallon had tears in his eyes now, not flowing, but sitting there, waiting. Jonathan leaned back, looked out at the audience. Not to perform, just to see them, real people, real eyes. He said he thought about canceling this interview. He said the last few weeks had been rough again. He said he didn't know what he would even say. But then this morning he saw something that told him to come anyway. A small sign, a quiet one, like the whisper again. And now sitting here, he said, I know why. Because there's someone watching tonight who feels like I felt that night. Someone who thinks they're out of reasons. And I need them to hear this. I need them to know they're not alone. Even if no one knows what they're going through. Even if they've never told a soul. They're not alone. Fallon reached out and touched his arm, just lightly. Still not speaking. And Jonathan turned back to him and said, That's why I'm here. But this wasn't the moment that broke Fallon. That would come later. Jonathan sat still for a while after that. Not quiet for drama, but because he was still carrying what he hadn't said yet. Fallon hadn't moved, not a laugh, not a nod, just watching. Letting it all sit. Most hosts would have jumped in by now, tried to lighten the tone, break the heaviness, move it along. But Fallon didn't. He just gave Jonathan space. Not because it made good television, but because something was happening in front of him that didn't need a producer. It needed silence. Jonathan leaned forward again and said the worst part of that season wasn't the pain. It was how normal it started to feel. How easy it was to forget what it felt like to be alive. He said he still went to church, still showed up for readings, still played the part. But every now and then, he'd catch himself staring at the wall during Mass, not hearing a single word. Just sitting there, hollow, and no one noticed. No one asked. Because he still looked like the version of himself people expected to see. That was the trick. You wear the mask long enough, and people stop asking what's underneath it. And eventually, you stop wondering yourself. He said when people see him out in public, they always smile. Always thank him for what his work meant to them. And he always means it when he says thank you back, always. But sometimes he goes home after those conversations and wonders how many of them would still care if they knew how much he struggles to believe the same words they thanked him for. And he didn't say that with bitterness. He said it like someone who was finally telling the truth. He said that's what shame does. It doesn't make you act out. It makes you disappear, quietly, slowly, without anyone even realizing it's happening. He said when you're known for bringing light, the worst thing in the world is realizing you can't feel any of it yourself. That's the part that breaks you, not the pain, not the pressure, but the disconnect. The distance between what people see and what you actually live with. Fallon blinked but didn't look away. His fingers rested on the desk, still. No tapping, no tension, just stillness. Jonathan kept going. He said he remembered a flight once where a woman came up to him in the airport and asked him to pray for her husband. She said they had just gotten the diagnosis and she didn't know what else to do. She said she didn't even go to church, but she trusted him because he seemed like someone who believed for real. And Jonathan said he smiled and nodded and promised to pray. And he did. But what he didn't tell her was that he hadn't prayed for himself in weeks. Not in a real way. Not in a way that felt like connection. He said he walked to the gate and sat down and felt like the biggest fraud in the world. Because he was asking God to help this man when he wasn't even sure God was still listening to him. And the guilt of that stayed with him for days. He said that's the thing people never understand about faith. They think it's a steady line, but for some of us, it's not. For some of us, it's a battle every morning, and some days you win. And some days you don't, but you still show up, you still try. And that trying counts for something, even when no one sees it. Especially then. He said there were days on set when he would finish a scene and go sit in his trailer and stare at the wall just trying to remember why he started any of this in the first place. Not because he didn't care, but because the weight felt bigger than him. Because when people think you're playing Jesus, they forget that you're still a man. Still human. Still bleeding inside just like anyone else. He said the hardest part of all wasn't the expectation. It was the silence after everyone left. That part, the part no one talks about. He said one night he sat on the bathroom floor of his apartment for 2 hours, not crying, not praying, just sitting. Because he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even decide if it mattered whether he got up or not. And that's when he realized how far gone he was, that he wasn't just tired, he was gone. And no one had noticed. Not even him. Fallon shifted slightly in his chair, not to break the moment, but to absorb it. Jonathan noticed and nodded slowly, like he could feel how heavy the words were landing. He said, "I know this isn't the interview anyone expected. And I know this might not make sense to most people watching. But I'm not here to sell hope like a product. I'm here because I barely held on. And I need someone else out there to know that they're not broken just because they feel lost." He said he thought about not sharing any of this. He said people warned him, said it might hurt his image, might confuse his followers, might cost him something. But then he looked at Fallon again and said, "That's the problem. We're so used to curated faith, we forget how to deal with honest faith, the messy kind, the barely holding on kind, the kind that doesn't look good on a poster." Fallon exhaled through his nose, not in frustration, in resonance. The kind that says someone just put words to something you felt but never voiced. Jonathan didn't stop. He said there's something deeply wrong with a world where we expect people to inspire us, but never let them be human. He said we've built an entire culture where leaders are only allowed to struggle once they've overcome it, only allowed to speak about the valley once they're safely on the mountaintop. He said that's backwards. Because it's the middle where people need to hear from you the most. That's where they're bleeding. That's where they're breaking. That's where they think no one sees them. And he said for the first time in years, he didn't want to hide from that part of himself anymore. Because hiding wasn't helping. Not him, not anyone. He said the pain didn't make him special. The honesty did. Fallon swallowed, eyes still locked on him. No jokes, no applause. Jonathan looked straight ahead and said, "And the truth is, I'm still in it. I'm still working it out. I'm not speaking from the end of the story. I'm speaking from the middle. And if you're there too, whoever you are, just know you're not the only one." Then he paused, just long enough to make the entire room forget they were watching a show. But the moment that would finally break Fallon hadn't come yet. We're not there. Not even close. Jonathan sat there still. Not out of hesitation or strategy, but because everything he needed to say, every shard of truth he hadn't allowed to surface yet, was weighing on him. Fallon didn't interrupt, didn't rush him. The air between them was heavy, not in a tense or awkward way, but in a way that said something significant was unfolding, something real, and that it didn't need to be rushed or cleaned up for consumption. It needed to sit. Fallon knew this, instinctively. Most hosts would have scrambled for words, tried to break the silence, maybe with a joke or a reassuring gesture. But Fallon wasn't like most hosts. He was quiet, letting the moment breathe. Fallon's own eyes were fixed on Jonathan, but he didn't look for a soundbite. He was just present. The same presence Jonathan needed to feel. Jonathan had told stories before on sets, in interviews, during speeches, but none of them ever felt as urgent as this one. His words weren't carefully chosen for the sake of a polished image. This was raw. He wasn't talking for the cameras. He wasn't speaking to an audience. He was speaking to himself, to the boy he used to be, the man he was now, and the man he was trying to become. "It's funny," Jonathan began again, his voice softer now. "You think you know what your limits are. You think you know how much you can carry before you break. But there's a kind of quiet breaking that doesn't announce itself. You don't even know it's happening until you look up one day and realize you've been living in a different kind of silence for a long time." He shifted, leaning forward just a little, but still his gaze wasn't on Fallon. It was distant, unfocused, as if he wasn't just telling this story for Fallon's sake, but for everyone who had ever felt the same quiet, despair, and never knew how to name it. "Every day felt like a performance," Jonathan said, his voice almost a whisper. "A kind of juggling act. Smile here. Do the work there. Always make sure the camera is on you, but not too much. always give enough but never give everything. And all the while, you're just walking through life, just keeping your head above water, pretending that you've got it all together. That's the part no one tells you about. You see it in others maybe. You think it's impossible. But then you start living it, and suddenly, you're doing it too. Jonathan's hands rested on his lap now, fingers still laced together. He wasn't fidgeting, just holding on to the stillness, as if it was the one thing that grounded him in this conversation. And when I say it started to feel normal, I mean it started to feel like the silence was a second skin. I didn't know where the actor ended and where I began. I'd go to church, stand up, pray. But I wasn't really there. I wasn't hearing any of it. Just sitting there, thinking I'm supposed to feel something, right? And the harder I tried to feel something, the emptier it felt. Fallon's breath caught, but he said nothing. Jonathan's confession wasn't something you could just comment on. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a window into a darkness that had wrapped itself so tightly around him. It was almost a second nature. I was doing everything right, Jonathan continued. I showed up. I said the words. I looked like the man I was supposed to be. I smiled for the cameras. I gave interviews about faith. But the truth is, I'd been pretending for so long, I didn't even know what it meant to believe anymore. Not really. It's easy to forget, you know. It's easy to fool yourself into thinking that the act of showing up means you still care. But it doesn't. And no one notices. He let that last part hang in the air. No one notices. Not even the ones closest to you. Because everyone has a mask they wear. And when you wear it long enough, you forget what you look like without it. I didn't even know I was lost, he said quietly, looking down at his hands again. I didn't realize how much I'd lost myself until one night I found myself staring at a wall in my apartment, unable to get up, unable to even tell myself why I needed to move. It wasn't just exhaustion. It wasn't just burnout. I was gone, I was hollow, and I didn't know how to get back. Not to faith, not to my work, not to anything. The weight of those words hung in the room. It wasn't the kind of moment where you rush to fill the space with reassurance. It was the kind of moment that needed to breathe. Fallon could feel it. He didn't need to speak. Jonathan wasn't asking for sympathy, but something deeper, something that could only be offered in the silence. I think, Jonathan continued, voice shaking now, not from weakness but from the force of an emotion he had long buried. The hardest part is realizing that people want you to be strong. They want you to be the one who never wavers. They want you to be the one who stands firm. They want the poster child for faith and strength. But here's the thing no one tells you. There's no glory in struggling quietly. There's no applause for keeping your head down and pushing through when no one knows how much it hurts. And so, you keep it inside. You put on the smile. You play the part. You try to make everyone believe it's okay, even when it's not. He paused again, breathing deeply as though the next words he spoke were ones he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now. I wasn't sure how much longer I could do it, Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. And that's the truth. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep showing up. But then I remembered something, a moment from a show just like this one. It was years ago, but I never forgot it. A guest had talked about losing someone, about grief and faith, and about how the two can clash. And for the first time in weeks, something cracked open in me, not a flood. Not a breakthrough, just a crack. But that crack, that tiny opening, it let in the light. He looked up at Fallon now, locking eyes. That's the moment that saved me. The smallest spark of light in the middle of the darkness. And sometimes, that's all you need. Not a huge revelation, not a loud voice. Just the quiet reminder that you're not alone in it. Fallon didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence now was a kind of affirmation. Jonathan wasn't looking for answers. He wasn't looking for a way out. He was simply sharing his journey, the mess of it, the struggle. The hope that had to be fought for and found even in the smallest of cracks. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of his words beginning to settle. "I came here tonight not to preach or to offer answers," he said, his voice finally steady again. "I came here because someone out there, someone who's watching right now, feels exactly like I did. Someone who's in that same silent place, thinking they've been forgotten. And I want them to know they're not. They're not alone." He leaned back in his chair, still but breathing with the knowledge that he had spoken his truth, not for praise or recognition, but for someone else's survival. "That's why I'm here," he said softly, but with a weight that made the room feel even quieter than before. And yet, Fallon remained silent. The camera caught the tension in the room, the kind of tension that wasn't uncomfortable or forced. It was the weight of raw honesty, an unspoken understanding that needed no words. Jonathan had shared his truth, and for the first time, the world had been invited to see the man behind the mask. The man who was still in it, the man who was still fighting. But the moment, this moment, wouldn't be the one that broke Fallon. Not yet. There was more to come. And we weren't there yet. The weight of Jonathan's words still lingered in the air, hanging like smoke. But there was a shift in the room now. It wasn't just the sound of silence. It was a kind of peace, a delicate moment between past pain and future hope. Fallon, still seated across from Jonathan, finally spoke, not out of a need to fill the silence, but because the quiet was its own kind of answer. He leaned in just slightly, his voice soft but clear. "Do you believe it now, Jonathan? That you're not alone?" Jonathan's eyes flickered with a sudden intensity, a vulnerability that still hadn't been fully explored in him. He had shared the weight of his struggle, but this was the moment that mattered, the one where the words, the healing, and the experience all collided. "I do," Jonathan said, his voice steady now. But it wasn't just the answer, it was the realization that the man he'd been before, the one so deeply buried in his own silence, had been reborn in the simplest of moments. The realization that faith wasn't a destination, but an ongoing process. A choice to live, to fight, to feel even when the path was blurred by doubt. For a moment, Fallon didn't speak. He simply nodded, acknowledging the strength in Jonathan's voice, in the certainty that had emerged. There was something profound about the way Jonathan's journey had shifted, how he had gone from speaking of his darkness to acknowledging the light that had gradually seeped through. The cracks in his armor had created spaces for the rawest parts of him to breathe. But even though the silence had broken, even though the story had been told, the real revelation hadn't quite arrived yet. The weight of everything he had shared had been important, so much had been said. But there was more to it. So much more. "Do you know what's hardest?" Jonathan asked, his voice quieter now. His gaze never left Fallon, but this time there was a softening, a tenderness he hadn't allowed himself before. "The hardest part isn't the struggle. It's the decision to let go of the fight when you realize you're fighting the wrong thing. I used to think that fighting through the pain was the answer, that bearing it all, silently, made me strong. But the truth is, I wasn't fighting for the right reasons. I wasn't fighting for myself, for my own peace. I was just holding onto the weight of things that were never meant to be mine." Jonathan's shoulders relaxed, a subtle but profound release of tension. Fallon could see the change in him now, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. This wasn't just the telling of a story. This was Jonathan's transformation in real time. The man before Fallon wasn't the same person who had walked in hours ago. "I spent so long convincing myself that faith was something that could be controlled, that it was a series of rules I could follow, an image I could project. But what I learned is that faith isn't a rule book. It's a relationship. It's messy. It's full of doubt. It's messy because it's human, and that's okay." "That's more than okay," Jonathan said, the calmness in his voice growing. Fallon's gaze didn't leave Jonathan. This wasn't just a performance. This wasn't just Jonathan answering questions for the sake of the show. This was Jonathan confronting his own story, his own soul, and sharing it with the world in a way that felt real, vulnerable, beautiful. And for the first time in years, Jonathan allowed himself to accept that not everything had to be perfect, that not every answer had to be found immediately. He wasn't going to have it all together, and that was okay. I didn't know what healing looked like, Jonathan continued. I thought it would be something dramatic, some grand epiphany where everything would suddenly click. But healing, it's like the sun rising, slowly, gently, inch by inch, until one day you realize the darkness is gone. It doesn't happen all at once. It takes time. It takes patience. But you start to see the warmth again, little by little. And when that warmth hits you, you know it's real. Fallon leaned back, his arms crossed, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. And that's what this is, isn't it? This moment, this conversation. It's part of your healing. Jonathan nodded, looking away for the first time in the entire interview. It wasn't a look of shame, but one of quiet understanding. It was the same look someone might have when they finally accept that their journey, no matter how imperfect, is still worth taking. Yeah, Jonathan whispered. It is, and it feels good. It feels right. To just be. To be real. To not have to hide the broken parts anymore. The conversation shifted again, but this time, Fallon could see the deep transformation. It wasn't about seeking validation from anyone else. It was Jonathan finally looking at himself, not the public figure, not the image, not the mask, but the real man beneath it all. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt okay with that, with him, with where he was. I used to be afraid of showing this side of me, Jonathan admitted, the words carrying the weight of years spent hiding. Afraid that if I let people see this part, the vulnerable part, the part that doesn't have all the answers, that they'd see me as weak. But I've learned something crucial. True strength isn't about hiding your flaws. It's about accepting them. It's about being okay with not being perfect. It's about showing up day after day, even when you feel like you can't, even when you feel like you've lost your way. Because the truth is, you haven't lost your way. You've just shifted. You're still moving forward. And there it was, the moment of release, the culmination of everything Jonathan had been fighting to understand. He wasn't just talking about strength anymore. He wasn't just speaking of belief in an abstract sense. He was talking about the real work it took to heal, to forgive, and most importantly, to accept. I don't have all the answers, Fallon. I never will, Jonathan said, with a sincerity that resonated deeply. But I don't need them anymore. I just need to keep going. And I need to trust that wherever I am, wherever I'm going, it's going to be okay. Because I'm not alone. Fallon didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Jonathan sat there, a man reborn in the simplest of ways, by admitting his weakness, by confronting the very things that had held him captive for so long. And the power of that truth wasn't just in the telling of it. It was in the living of it. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt free. Free from the fear of not being enough. Free from the pressure to be perfect. Free from the burden of his own silence. And in that moment, he realized something truly beautiful. Healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about embracing it. The cracks, the flaws, the doubts, the pain, it was all a part of the journey. And Jonathan wasn't just surviving it. He was living it. Fully, finally. Thank you for giving me the space to say all of this, Jonathan said, his voice steady but laced with a deep gratitude. I needed to say it out loud, and now I feel like I can finally breathe again. Fallon's smile was soft, but his eyes were full of respect. You're not alone, Jonathan. You never were. The camera lingered on Jonathan for a moment longer. The light in his eyes wasn't the same as it had been before. It wasn't the kind of light that came from performing or pretending. It was the light that came from truth, from release, from freedom. And as the interview drew a close, The weight of everything that had been said lingered in the air, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It wasn't burdensome. It was just right. Jonathan had found peace in the process, not in the destination, but in the act of healing itself. And for the first time, he understood. Healing was never about being perfect. It was about showing up. It was about embracing the mess and walking through it anyway. And that, for Jonathan, was everything.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.